Under a parking lot at a quiet Illinois state park, the ground was waiting to detonate one of American archaeology's most repeated lies. For 30 years, textbooks blamed nearly 20,000 vanished people on themselves. They cut down their own forests and drowned their own farmland. That explanation came from a field that never checked it, then printed it into museum placards nobody rewrote. Geoarchaeologist Caitlin Rankin decided to actually test it. This is Cahokia, the largest city in North America before Columbus. And what she found in the dirt did not close the case. It blew it wide open. Most Americans have never heard the name, even though this place once sat less than 10 miles from what is now downtown St. Louis, across the river from the Gateway Arch. At its peak, somewhere around the year 1100, close to 20,000 people lived across roughly 6 square miles of Mississippi River floodplain, inside a city built almost entirely out of dirt. No stone temples, no brick walls, just earth carried basket by basket, generation after generation, packed and layered into more than 120 mounds. The largest of them, now called Monk's Mound, went up in at least 14 separate construction stages and still rises about 100 feet into the sky. Its base covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. In front of it once stretched the Grand Plaza, a leveled, engineered public space large enough to hold the entire city for ceremonies, and nearby, a ring of massive wooden posts archaeologists call Woodhenge, aligned to track the solstices with startling precision. For a city built before the wheel arrived in North America, before horses, before iron tools, that kind of engineering should stop you. Cahokia rivaled the population of London at roughly the same moment in history. It was the largest settlement north of Mexico, and by some estimates, the largest city built on this continent before the 20th century. Cahokia was never just one mound complex either. It anchored a wider network of connected precincts at East St. Louis, at St. Louis itself, at Mitchell and Poulter, threaded together by thousands of smaller farming hamlets across the floodplain. Some archaeologists put the population of Greater Cahokia, counting every precinct, as high as 30,000 people. That is a city, in the modern sense of the word, sitting in the middle of the American Midwest, 4 centuries before the United States existed, complete with neighborhoods, suburbs, and satellite towns, spread across a river valley most Americans drive past today without a second glance. Picture the labor behind it. Tens of thousands of individual basket loads of dirt, carried by hand, packed down, layered again, across generations of workers who would never see the mound finished in their own lifetime. Archaeologist Timothy Pauketat, who has spent decades studying the site, has described Cahokia as nothing less than ancient America's great city on the Mississippi. That is not casual praise. That is a serious scholar putting a Native American city in the same conversation as the great urban centers of the ancient world. The world eventually noticed. In 1964, the federal government named it a National Historic Landmark. In 1982, UNESCO added Cahokia Mounds to its World Heritage List, one of only a handful of sites in the entire country to earn that designation. Museums built exhibits around it. Textbooks used it as proof that pre-Columbian America was never empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was already home to real cities, real engineering, real political power, organized around a skyline of earth instead of stone. That is the version of Cahokia most people encounter, if they encounter it at all. A lost American city, mysteriously grand, sitting quietly in a state park a few minutes off the interstate. But that recognition came late, and it followed a much older, uglier mistake. For most of the 19th century, the dominant theory among American settlers, and even some early scholars, was not that native people built these mounds at all. A vanished race was blamed instead. sometimes cast as Vikings, sometimes as a lost tribe of Israel, sometimes as refugees from Mexico, anything except the direct ancestors of the native nations the United States government was actively displacing at the very same time. It was a comfortable myth for the people telling it, and a convenient one, because it let a country erase the achievements of the people it was pushing off their own land. That theory did not fully collapse until the 20th century, once careful excavation made it impossible to deny who had actually done the building. Cahokia's story, in other words, has already survived one deeply wrong explanation, protected for far too long, simply because it was convenient. The ecocide theory would turn out to be the second. And then, sometime after the year 1200, that skyline started to empty. By around 1350, the mound stood mostly abandoned. By 1400, the Great Plaza was silent, the fires cold, the causeways unused, grass slowly reclaiming packed earth that had once carried the footsteps of thousands of people every single day. A city that had taken centuries to build was gone within a handful of generations, and for a mystery of that scale, you would expect the accepted explanation to be locked down tight, tested from every angle, checked against the dirt itself. It wasn't. For most of the last 30 years, one answer has dominated almost every textbook, museum placard, and classroom slide, and almost nobody had gone back to confirm it was actually true. In 1993, researchers working out of Southern Illinois University Edwardsville proposed a theory that spread fast because it made intuitive sense. Building a city this size took wood, and a lot of it. Timber for construction, timber for a palisade wall, eventually built around the ceremonial core, timber for cooking fires that fed thousands of households, day after day, year after year, for centuries. The theory argued that Cahokians stripped the surrounding uplands bare to feed that appetite, and once the trees were gone, the exposed soil had nothing left to hold it in place. Rain hit the bare hillsides, washed straight down into the floodplain, and buried the fields the city depended on to survive, silting up the very ground that once produced enough surplus maize to feed 20,000 people. Cahokia, in other words, choked on its own success. It became a cautionary tale repeated for decades in books, documentaries, and lecture halls. A civilization so hungry for growth that it wrecked the ground under its own feet. A warning wrapped in the shape of a lost city. The kind of story that lets modern audiences feel a little smug about how much smarter we've supposedly become. It is a clean story. It has a beginning, a middle, and a moral. It is also, as far as anyone can tell, a story nobody actually tested with a shovel for almost 30 years. While that explanation calcified into consensus, other details about Cahokia sat quietly in the background, waiting for someone to ask why they refused to fit. In 1967, archaeologists opened a section of a low ridgetop earthwork, easy to overlook next to the towering bulk of Monk's Mound, now known as Mound 72. What came out of the dirt still unsettles the people who study it. More than 270 individuals, buried across a single location, layer stacked on layer, some in what look like mass graves, others arranged with unmistakable ceremonial intention. One burial held two men laid out on a raised platform of roughly 20,000 shell beads, shaped deliberately into the outline of a bird taking flight. The beads themselves brought in from coastal trade networks hundreds of miles away. Archaeologists still call it the beaded burial, and it remains one of the most elaborate funerary displays ever documented in ancient North America. Nearby, other burials show patterns consistent with ritualized, staged death, including groups of individuals interred together in ways that suggest sacrifice rather than natural loss, their bodies positioned with a precision that leaves little room for accident. This was not a quiet farming settlement. This was a city willing to turn mass death into political theater, staged in full view of its own population, presumably to send a message about who held power and how far that power reached, and what happened to anyone who challenged it. Then came the teeth. Bone can be reworked by the body over a lifetime, but tooth enamel cannot. Once it finishes forming in childhood, it stays chemically frozen for as long as the tooth survives, sometimes for 1,000 years underground. Researchers analyzing strontium isotopes locked inside that enamel, a fingerprint tied to the specific water and soil a person grew up eating and drinking, found that a striking share of the people buried at Cahokia were not local at all. That isotope signature works like a tiny mineral passport nobody can forge or erase after the fact. In some published samples, close to a third of individuals tested carried a strontium signature pointing somewhere outside the American bottom entirely. Broader reviews estimate that immigrants made up anywhere from 10 to 30% of the population across Greater Cahokia at its height. This was not a closed, isolated community. It was a magnet, pulling people in from across a huge stretch of the Mississippi and Midwest river systems, some of them arriving as children and dying decades later as adults inside the city that had absorbed them, then burying many of them among a ruling class that staged its own funerals like a public warning. And around that same ceremonial core, archaeologists have traced the remains of a massive wooden palisade, an estimated 20,000 logs, complete with regularly spaced bastions for defenders, torn down and rebuilt at least 4 separate times over the life of the city. Each rebuilding required a fresh forest's worth of timber, cut, hauled, and set upright, which is itself a strange detail for a city supposedly running out of wood to spare. A wall like that does not get built by accident, and it does not get rebuilt again and again without a reason. Something inside those walls needed protecting, or something outside them needed keeping out. Downstream, at the East St. Louis precinct of Greater Cahokia, archaeologists have documented a large-scale burning event that destroyed a significant portion of that district, leaving behind thick layers of charred posts, collapsed roofing, and burned storage pits packed with grain that never got eaten. Researchers studying the burn pattern argue it looks less like an accidental fire and more like a deliberate, targeted destruction of specific structures and stored goods, the kind of violence that leaves a signature in ash and charcoal instead of paperwork. Whatever else was happening at Cahokia in its final centuries, it was not a peaceful fade into the sunset. For a while, some archaeologists leaned toward internal collapse instead of environmental catastrophe. Think about what it would take to hold 20,000 people from dozens of different homelands inside one city built around ritual and hierarchy. That kind of order does not run on farmland alone. It runs on belief. Maybe political authority failed after one bad harvest too many, and the elite lost the ceremonial legitimacy that had held the whole system together, the way a currency collapses once people stop trusting the number printed on it. Maybe disease moved fast through a city this densely packed, spreading through shared water, shared granaries, shared ceremonial crowds, the way plague would later tear through crowded European capitals living in similar conditions. Both ideas are plausible on their face, and both are tempting precisely because they don't require blaming the climate or the river at all. Neither has ever been fully ruled out. But neither one, on its own, explained the specific claim that had already been locked into the record for 30 years. The one printed in textbooks with the most confidence, that the people of Cahokia destroyed their own environment. That particular claim needed a different kind of test. It needed someone to actually dig. That someone was a GEO archaeologist named Caitlin Rankin. Rankin grew up around heavy machinery, her father having spent years operating it, and she carried some of that same hands-on instinct into archaeology. If you want to know what really happened to a piece of ground, you do not read about it in someone else's book. You open it up and look for yourself. So she set out to do something almost embarrassingly simple, given how long the ecocide theory had gone unchecked. She would dig directly into the floodplain around one of Cahokia's mounds and read the actual soil layers the theory depended on. If deforestation had triggered the kind of erosion the theory described, the stratigraphy should show it clearly. A visible break in the layers a sudden dump of washed-in sediment sitting on top of older, undisturbed soil, dated to precisely the period when Cahokians were supposedly stripping their hillsides bare and sending mud sliding downhill into their own cornfields. Between 2017 and 2018, her team opened that ground and read what was actually sitting inside it, layer by layer, inch by inch. The kind of patient, unglamorous work that rarely makes the news, but occasionally rewrites it. Every stratum tells a story if you're willing to sit with it long enough. A flood layer looks different from a stable one. A slow accumulation of undisturbed soil looks different from a violent, rapid deposit of eroded sediment. The distinction is not subtle once you know what you're looking at, and Rankin knew exactly what she was looking for. There was no erosion event. Not during the centuries Cahokia was occupied. The ground surface stayed remarkably stable through the entire Mississippian period, the very stretch of time when, according to the theory, deforestation should have been actively burying the landscape under runoff. The first real disturbance to that soil didn't appear until the 1800s, when industrial-era development finally reshaped the floodplain for good. In plain terms, the smoking gun the ecocide theory needed was simply not down there. It never had been. Somebody just needed to look. Rankin published the results in the journal Geoarchaeology in 2021, alongside colleagues Barrier and Horsley, and the reaction from other archaeologists said as much about the field as it did about Cahokia itself. Washington University's T.R. Kidder, who had spent decades working in the region, pointed out something uncomfortable in the aftermath. An idea can be treated as settled fact for 30 years without a single person testing it against the ground, simply because it sounds plausible enough that nobody thinks to check. Rankin had gone and checked. In doing so, she had quietly dismantled one of American archaeology's most repeated explanations, using nothing more exotic than a shovel, a trowel, and careful attention to layers of dirt most visitors would walk straight past without a second glance. That should have settled the mystery. It didn't. It is worth asking honestly why a theory like that survives unchecked for 30 years in the first place. Part of the answer is simply how academic momentum works. Once an idea gets cited in enough papers, printed in enough textbooks, and repeated in enough museum tours, testing it starts to feel unnecessary, almost rude, like relitigating a settled argument. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable appeal buried inside the ecocide story. A theory that blames Cahokia's collapse on Cahokians themselves is a theory that asks nothing of anyone else. It does not implicate later land clearing, levee construction, or river engineering carried out by the settlers and industries that came after. It keeps the story contained, tidy, and safely in the past. Rankin's dig did not just overturn a stratigraphic claim, it quietly asked why that particular explanation had been so comfortable to believe for so long. If the people of Cahokia hadn't destroyed their own land, something else emptied the city. And a separate group of scientists, working with an entirely different kind of evidence, had already been building a case that pointed somewhere else, the river itself. In 2015, a team led by Samuel Munoz published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, built on sediment cores pulled from the bottom of two lakes, Horseshoe Lake, just a few miles from the mounds, and Grassy Lake, nearly 200 kilometers downstream. To pull a core like this, researchers drop a hollow tube straight down through the lake bed and draw up a cylinder of undisturbed mud, sometimes stretching back thousands of years, each layer stacked in the exact order it settled. Layers of flood sediment inside that column work a little like tree rings recording major Mississippi River flood events, stretching back roughly 1,800 years, visible as distinct bands of coarser, paler material sitting inside the finer, darker mud of ordinary years. For the river to deposit sediment that far from its banks, it would have needed to rise about 10 meters above its normal level at St. Louis. That is not an ordinary rainstorm. That is a catastrophic flood. the kind that reshapes an entire floodplain in a single season, drowning fields, wrecking stores of grain, and forcing thousands of people to relocate with almost no warning. The Corps recorded 8 major floods across that 1,800-year span, and the timing was hard to ignore. Between roughly 600 and 1200, the period when Cahokia rose to power and reached its peak, large floods were essentially absent from the record. Then, right around 1200, just as the city's decline began, the big floods returned. Munoz and his team argued the two patterns were connected. An unusually long, dry, flood-free stretch of the Mississippi had helped make Cahokia's rise possible in the first place, and the return of the river's natural flood cycle helped bring that rise to an end. Other archaeologists pushed back immediately, and not quietly. Researchers Sarah Bears, Melissa Baltus, and Megan Buchanan published a direct rebuttal in the same journal, with a title that reads less like a polite academic footnote and more like a challenge. Correlation does not equal causation. Their argument was blunt. A flood layer showing up in a lake core does not prove that flood emptied a city. It only proves the river rose. Their own excavation evidence, including work around a causeway Bears herself, had helped uncover linking the ceremonial core to outlying neighborhoods, suggested Cahokians hadn't fully abandoned the floodplain until well after the mid-1300s, decades later than the flood-driven timeline implied, and that sections of the city were still being rebuilt and reoccupied during the very window Munoz framed as decline. If people were still living, building, and burying their dead in the floodplain after the supposed flood-driven exodus, they argued, the flood could not have been the single decisive blow. Munoz's team replied that they had never claimed a single flood caused the collapse, only that conditions on the river had shifted at a suspicious moment in the story, and that correlation, while not proof on its own, is still exactly the kind of evidence a real investigation has to take seriously. The disagreement never fully resolved. It simply became part of the permanent record, two respected teams of scientists staring at the same missing city and reaching two different verdicts, in print, under their own names, in the same academic journal for anyone willing to read both papers back to back. Then a second line of evidence arrived, pointing at drought instead of flood. In 2019, a team led by A.J. White published a study using an unusual kind of proxy: fecal stanols, chemical markers left behind in soil by human waste, which break down at predictable rates and accumulate in lake sediment in proportion to how many people were relieving themselves upstream. Researchers used them to estimate population at a given time, almost like a population thermometer buried in the mud for centuries, invisible to the naked eye, but readable in a laboratory. Their data showed flooding and a shift toward drier, warmer season conditions arriving together around 1150, decades before Cahokia's population began its steepest decline. 2 years later, a team led by Samuel Bird pulled an even longer climate record out of Horseshoe Lake itself, using oxygen isotopes preserved in its sediment, a chemical signature that shifts depending on how much water evaporates versus falls as rain, and found conditions turning sharply more arid across the 1200s and into the 1300s, consistent with a punishing, extended drought layered directly on top of the flood problem, stretching across generations rather than a single bad season. Two invisible chemical signals, pulled from the same lake mud, both pointing toward the same uncomfortable decades. For a moment, that looked like an answer. Flood and drought, arriving together, squeezing a city already stretched thin, its farmland caught between too much water and not enough. Then Rankin went back into the ground a second time and complicated her own field's newest theory. Working with botanist Natalie Mueller, Rankin examined the vegetation record preserved at Cahokia across that same drought window, publishing the results in 2024 in the journal The Holocene. Plant remains and pollen preserved in ancient soil work like a botanical fingerprint of the landscape at any given moment, recording exactly which species were growing, thriving, or dying back in a given year. If a severe, sustained drought had wrecked Cahokia's crops the way the climate data implied, that record should show it clearly. A shift toward drought-tolerant prairie grasses, crowding out the maize fields that fed the city. The botanical signature of failed harvests, written directly into the soil. It didn't happen. The vegetation stayed remarkably consistent straight through the supposed crisis years. No sudden takeover by hardier, thirstier plant species. No gap in cultivation the layers could point to. Muller would later put it plainly. There was no sign of prairie grasses taking over, the exact signature you would expect if crop failure had been widespread across the growing seasons in question. The drought was real, recorded in the isotopes, undeniable in the climate record. On the ground, Rankin actually tested the city's fields. By every visible measure, did not collapse because of it. So now there are 3 tested layers of evidence, and none of them fully agree with each other. The deforestation theory, tested and falsified, disproven in the exact ground it was supposed to be written into. The flood theory, real river data, disputed cause, contested in the same journal it was published in by researchers who dug the same region. The drought theory, real climate data, confirmed by 2 separate isotope records, yet contradicted by the crop record sitting in the ground at Cahokia itself. Each theory survives one kind of scrutiny and stumbles on another, which is exactly what makes this case so difficult to close with a single headline. The ground itself is still being interrogated. In 2023, a University of Michigan team led by archaeologist Rob Beck began a multi-year magnetometry survey across more than 5 square kilometers of central Cahokia, essentially reading the buried city's magnetic signature to map structures and features no one has ever excavated. Separately, researchers Sarah Bears and Melissa Baltus, working under a National Science Foundation grant, have been running magnetometry across outlying Cahokian neighborhoods with names like the Rauch Mound Group and Rattlesnake West, hunting for the ordinary residential fabric of the city that rarely makes it into the textbooks. Aerial and satellite-based LiDAR surveys have separately confirmed that Monk's Mound itself is still losing ground, quite literally, slumping and eroding at measurable rates year over year. None of these newer surveys have overturned Rankin's findings or resolved the flood versus drought dispute. What they have done is confirm just how much of Cahokia remains unmapped, unread, and unexplained, sitting directly beneath the feet of the archaeologists trying to solve it. 3 teams of serious scientists, 3 separate data sets, and Cahokia's empty mounds, sitting in the middle of all of it, still not fully explained by any single theory on offer. What makes this stranger is the scale of what happened next, because Cahokia's decline was never an isolated event. Archaeologists call the wider pattern the vacant quarter, a term coined by Harvard's Stephen Williams to describe roughly 50,000 square miles of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, where mound building and large ceremonial centers fell silent across a similar window, broadly between 1450 and 1550. That is an area larger than most countries on Earth, falling quiet within a few generations. Ceremonial centers extinguished one after another across an entire river system. Whatever happened at Cahokia was never just one city's failure, it was part of something regional, something bigger than a single flood, a single drought, or a single bad harvest, spread across a landscape the size of a small country. But vacant is the wrong word, and newer research has started to prove it. The same fecal stanol method used to track Cahokia's decline was later turned around and used to track what happened afterward in a follow-up study published in 2020. The watershed did not stay empty. Population data shows people moving back into the region, likely ancestors of the Illinois Confederation, with numbers climbing toward a new peak around 1650, centuries after Cahokia's mounds went quiet. The story was never really about a people vanishing. It was about people who left, regrouped elsewhere, and eventually returned, a detail the word vanish tends to erase, whether it shows up in a video title, a 19th century survey report, or a museum label that never got updated. The descendants never disappeared either. The Osage Nation traces direct ancestral lines back to the mound-building societies of the Mississippi Valley, a connection supported by both oral history and linguistic research linking the Osage language to the wider Dagiha-Sioux family once spoken across this region. Osage Nation Historic Preservation Officer Andrea Hunter now works directly with archaeologists on how Cahokia's story gets told and whose remains eventually go home. The University of Illinois runs an active repatriation project focused specifically on Cahokia, consulting with tribal nations across the country on returning human remains and funerary objects scattered through more than a century of excavation and museum collecting, boxed and shelved in storage rooms far from the ground they were taken from. In 2024, additional acreage at Sugarloaf Mound, St. Louis's last surviving mound, was formally transferred to Osage ownership, one small, concrete step in a much longer process, decades after the Osage first purchased part of that same property to keep it out of developers' hands entirely. This is not a closed case resting quietly inside a textbook. It is an open, ongoing, occasionally uncomfortable negotiation happening right now between institutions built to study the past and communities still living its aftermath in the present tense, still deciding mound by mound and archive box by archive box who gets to tell this story next. Which brings the story back to that levee. The floodplain that may have helped end Cahokia is the same floodplain Cahokia Mound sits on today, and it is now defended by roughly $75 million of modern levee engineering, part of a system protecting more than 170 square miles, over 150,000 residents, and billions of dollars in infrastructure, a system the Army Corps of Engineers explicitly credits with protecting the UNESCO World Heritage Site itself. Just downstream, the modern town of Cahokia Heights still floods badly enough that after storms dropped more than 9 inches of rain in a single 2-day span, a U.S. senator announced tens of millions of dollars in federal funding to address chronic drainage failures there, a reminder that this floodplain has never fully stopped fighting the people who live on it. The ground that once, by some accounts, turned against a city of 20,000 people is now held back by concrete and engineered earthworks, built by descendants of the same kind of civilization that once assumed it already understood exactly what went wrong the first time. Recent levee rehabilitation and survey work in the area, including work along the nearby Prairie du Pont-Levee, has turned up archaeological sites during routine cultural resource reviews, the kind of quiet, procedural digging that rarely makes headlines but still shapes what future archaeologists will have access to. So far, every one of those sites has been assessed and judged not significant enough to qualify for the National Register of Historic Places, and none has produced the kind of decisive new discovery that would finally close this case. That is worth saying plainly, because the honest version of this mystery is more unsettling than a tidy answer would be. Nobody has yet found the one piece of ground that explains everything. What the last decade of digging has actually produced is a slow, methodical dismantling of the explanation people were comfortable repeating, replaced by 3 competing, only partly compatible theories, and a widening recognition that the people who built this city never fully left the story at all. Cahokia's Interpretive Center closed its doors in 2022 for renovations originally budgeted at around $5.5 million. By the time it finally reopened to the public in June of 2026, delays and rising costs had pushed the real price closer to $12 million, 4 years behind schedule. Its exhibits updated to reflect research that keeps shifting under archaeologists' feet, even as visitors walk back through the door. Every new panel on that wall is, in a sense, a temporary answer, waiting for the next study to complicate it further. Monk's Mound still stands where it has stood for 9 centuries, still slowly eroding at its edges by a few measurable centimeters every year. still the largest earthwork north of Mexico, and still in the most literal sense, unfinished business. Somewhere beneath a modern Illinois levee, the ground that swallowed one theory is still holding on to the rest of its secrets. The soil disagreed with the story once already. Every test since has only widened the disagreement, layer by layer, study by study, one falsified theory at a time. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound today, and you are standing on top of one of the largest unsolved cases in American history, dressed up as a quiet state park with a gift shop and a parking lot. The levee holds the river back. The mound holds its answer back too. And somewhere in that floodplain, under 100 feet of hand-carried earth and 8 centuries of silence, the next shovel is still waiting to ask the right question.